Welcome to the Energy Capital Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Lewin. My guest this week is Tyler Norris, a researcher at Duke University, who along with the team of researchers at Duke produced an impactful report called Rethinking Load Growth. What they looked at here was what everybody in the energy world is talking about these days. How are we going to accommodate all of these data centers that are coming? And Texas is likely going to get more of its share of data centers than a lot of other places for a variety of reasons. It's easier to interconnect here. There's a lot of low-cost renewables available. There's a lot of things that Texas has going for it. But how can we accommodate all that load without causing grid reliability problems or raising costs? And Tyler and his team in Rethinking Load Growth talked about one of the ways to do that. If these data centers have even a small amount of load flexibility, it frees up large amounts of capacity. So we talked about that, how even 0.25% or 0.5% could free up many gigawatts of space. And the same holds true when you get down to the residential side. If we could do some things on the residential side to reduce demand, we can also free up space for data centers. This is an active conversation right now at the legislature. Senate Bill 6, House Bill 3970. These are bills that include different concepts for how to integrate large loads. It was a very timely conversation. I hope you enjoy it. I learned a lot from Tyler and from the paper. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. And as always, please give us a 5-star rating. It really does help people find the podcast. This is a free episode, but it is not free to produce. We have both the Texas Energy and Power newsletter and paid episodes of Energy Capital Podcast that are available to you if you subscribe at douglewin.com, DOUGLEWIN.com. And thank you so much for listening, and thanks for your support. Let's dive in. Tyler Norris, welcome to the Energy Capital Podcast.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much, Doug.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. Excited to talk to you. This report that you have put out, Rethinking Load Growth, assessing the potential for integration of large flexible loads in U.S. power systems, obviously got a lot of attention, lots of folks talking about it all around the industry. Before we jump into that, just very briefly, just tell the audience a little bit about yourself and kind of what your focus is there at Duke at the Nicholas Institute.
Yeah, sure thing. So I'm a fellow and pursuing my PhD in electric power systems at Duke University's Nicholas School. I'm a somewhat non-traditional PhD student in that I came into the program with about 12 years of experience in the energy sector. I started at the Department of Energy working on tech commercialization programs, spent a couple years at S&P Global doing their North American electricity market outlook, and then spent about 5.5 years in large-scale solar and solar plus storage development at Cypress Creek Renewables, where I ended up doing a lot of work in front of the public utility commissions, working with consultants on, electricity simulation models and trying to get better outcomes for resource planning and interconnection. And that was the part of the job I loved the most. And so I figured if I could go deeper in a PhD program, I could be of greater service. And so just briefly, a lot of interest has been on kind of grid interconnection, especially for large generators. But, it turns out that a lot of the study methods for large generators are similar for the large loads from an interconnection standpoint. So that's why we've gotten into the large load interconnection side of this too.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, right? Just in these last couple of years, for the longest time, nobody really talked about large load interconnection, which wasn't a thing that really came up very much unless you were like way, way in the weeds in some technical forum or something. And now it is the topic du jour, which brings us to your study, this Rethinking Load Growth, really getting into large flexible loads. Why don't we just start at the highest level? What are kind of some of the main takeaways? What do you want people to know about this report, some of the key findings?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just give a really quick backdrop, which is that this emerged from conversations primarily with state utility regulators and other state level regulators last year through the Nicholas Institute, which is a think tank sort of attached to Duke University. And everyone's talking about how to accommodate load growth. And what the regulators were sort of saying is that we are hearing that, the new data centers are 100% inflexible and that we have to treat them as firm loads. But at the same time, right, we were seeing EPRI launch its data center flexibility initiative and other announcements, including from the Secretary of Energy Advisory Board, recommending progress on data center flexibility. And so there was kind of this juxtaposition. And so that was the prompt to us, is kind of dig into this and let's try to figure out what's going on and what the potential might be from a technical potential standpoint. And so we do, a qualitative characterization of why there's kind of this thesis right now that AI specialized data centers can be more flexible than the sort of legacy computational loads. And so we spend a decent amount of time in the paper on that. But we also did some modeling. And so I think that's what really caught people's attention primarily. And what we were looking at is this idea of how much new load, could you add to any given electricity market or balancing authority if the load was able to be flexible, or really more specifically, curtailable for a limited number of hours in the year during the most stressed grid conditions. And when you think about it that way, and you can look at so in traditional demand response programs for sort of peak shaving, they're kind of in this range of like 1% to 2% of the max uptime of the new load. And we've seen that in a couple key demand response programs. And so we ran it initially assuming that the new loads, let's just say hypothetically, that they were able to be flexible for 1% of their maximum uptime in a given year. And the numbers were so substantial in terms of how much new load you could add to a variety of balancing authorities that we decided to run it at 0.5% of the max potential uptime, and then again at 0.25%. And it turns out we were quite surprised just by the volume. And so just to put a number on it, at 0.5% curtailment, we looked at 95% of the country's load across 22 balancing authorities. It aggregates to about 98 gigawatts of new load you could add. And then at the 0.25% level, it aggregated to 76 gigawatts. And as people are probably aware, like that exceeds even like the upper end forecasts for how much data center load growth we expect over the next, 5 or 7 years. And so we want to be clear, like this is a first order kind of technical potential assessment. There are various limitations to it that we talk about in detail, including, we didn't account for transmission constraints, which it would be a much more extensive and longer term study. And you couldn't even do it for 22 balancing authorities because it would take so much time. So there are a variety of limitations that we can kind of get into, but the headline is sort of, go ahead.
Yeah. No, you're all good. And I just, this is the Energy Capital podcast. We talk about Texas and ERCOT. And I know you've been on a bunch of podcasts and talked about national. We're going to really drill into Texas and ERCOT here. So at that 0.25% level, 6.5 gigawatts of data centers could come on without any new capacity needed. At 0.5% reduction, 10 gigawatts, and at 1%, 15 gigawatts. Those are pretty extraordinary findings. And can you just talk a little bit, Tyler, about what does that 0.25 and 0.5 and 1% mean? So 1% of the hours out of the year, there's 8,760 hours, you're talking about 87 hours. But is that 87 hours of the data center just being shut off? Or is it maybe the data center running at its 50% max for 100 and something hours? Like what exactly does 0.25 and 0.5 and 1% entail? And then I'm also I want to make sure I got this right, that basically you would not need to add any more capacity and you could put on 15, 6.5, 10 or 15 gigawatts at those three different levels. You're of course not saying we don't need new generation. Of course we do. But as we're trying to add this generation, we could accommodate a significant amount of data centers if they come on with load flexibility. And even as we're adding more generation sources, we could take still more data centers if they were to come on with some flexibility. Is that the right way to look at it?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. Great prompt there. So first, start with those numbers. So it's a percent of the maximum possible uptime. And one of the findings that was surprising, that we assumed that during a substantial number of hours, you would have to shut off, the new load entirely down to zero. But what we found is that actually what we're really talking about primarily are partial curtailment events. And to kind of put some numbers on it, so at the 0.25%, so that's a share, of the maximum possible megawatt hour consumption of the new load in a given year. If they are curtailed for 0.25% of that in a given year, what we found is that translates to 85 hours on average in which some amount of curtailment would have to occur. But in about 90% of the hours, at least half of the new load is retained. And that kind of 90% figure actually sort of held for each of the curtailment limits. So, and even like in 50% or 60%, actually about 75% of the load is retained. So it's very rare that you're talking about, going all the way to zero or even anywhere near zero. And this is interesting because you can start to think about partial flexibility. So for example, instead of, needing to size, if you were using a battery storage, instead of needing to size that at, 100% of the max draw of the load, even if you size it at 20 to 25%, you could potentially get a lot of flexibility out of that. And the other thing I'll just mention is that, the duration of these events on average are also relatively low. It's sort of in this range of 3 to 5 hours. And of course, it varies from balancing authority to balancing authority. And let's be clear, it is an average, right? So you're going to have some events, extreme weather events that, push that up. So it's not to suggest that, you could handle every event solely with, 4-hour battery storage, but that is the average. And we found that to be informative.
Yeah, that is super interesting. And, so batteries would be one way to do it. You're putting batteries on site. You could obviously have other kinds of generators on site and that kind of thing. I found it really interesting, the discussion you had in the paper, though, about the different kinds of data center load. So you started this by saying you're having all these discussions and you're hearing from people, this data center load is just flat. It's 24/7, 365. I hear this all the time, too. This is comes up in discussions all the time. People are like, oh, but these data centers, they can't be moved around. You got into this in the paper, the difference between inference and learning. And then there's also a huge cooling load there too, which I think is just not talked about and appreciated enough. So yes, you can do batteries. There also is some load on site that can be shifted as well. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure thing. So maybe we'll take that in a couple parts. I want to start up front by saying that the data here is still limited, and this is just a feature of the industry right now. And this is a constraint facing all independent researchers, right? So Lawrence Berkeley National Lab just did a congressionally mandated data center energy usage report. It's probably the best, public analysis we have. And they very prominently state like there were a lot of limitations because we just don't have a lot of data on the actual day by day, hour by hour, season by season usage of the data centers. So with that said, so like just to start with the cooling loads, because I think like it in some ways it's fair to say these are 24/7, 365 constant loads, but even that starts to break down a little bit when you talk about interseasonal variation. And there's an aspect in which it's just sort of intuitive, right? Like if you put a data center at the South Pole and you put one in the middle of the Sahara Desert, right? Like they're going to have different cooling needs. And this extends in other geographies. And like you can go look right now, I mean, to Google's credit, right? Like they publish every quarter the power use effectiveness of all their data centers around the world. And you can go look at it right now. And what you can see is like, just for example, in their data center here in North Carolina, the usage is substantially lower in the winter than it is in the summer. I want to say it's like 1.06 versus, 1.25 in the summertime. So, we can see that happening.
Which Tyler means that in the winter, they're getting much more efficient use of the energy. They're using more of the energy, like a unit of energy to computing power in the winter than they're able to in the summer.
That's right. And, there could be other contributing factors, like without, seeing a more granular version of the usage. But presumably, the difference in the cooling needs is a substantial contributor there. So there already is some degree of interseasonal variation. And again, I wish we had a better data set on this to establish it. But nevertheless, like the legacy computational loads that were CPU dominated, right? Real-time cloud computing services, especially for global data centers, right? That are serving international needs and a bunch of international customers. Those were more constant flat loads. But as we're shifting to the AI specialized data centers that are much more heavy GPUs, the picture is starting to change. And we should say up front, like there's significant variation across the AI specialized data centers. Some may be used entirely for training purposes, right, for the neural nets. Some may be a mix of training and inference, and then some may be entirely for inference. So, it's still a little unclear. But to start with the training workloads, so these are, they're training the neural nets, like the foundational models, or it doesn't have to be foundational models. They do a bunch of other training workloads. Those can vary significantly, and there's interesting research. You can look at a chart of kind of pilot scale training runs, and the power use, it varies a lot. I mean, it can jump from like max draw down to 0. Some of this is like on a sub-minute basis, but that can vary. And then the inference loads, those certainly vary. And partly, we don't know what the demand is going to look like for inferencing. And I don't even think in some cases, right, the hyperscalers know exactly what the global market is going to look like for inferencing. But there's likely to be some variation there, even on a sub-daily basis. So that's a meaningful part of it. And then, there are other aspects of the potential variation in the load, but I think it's helpful to clarify that in not all cases, right, are these like 100% constant 24/7, 365 loads.
Yeah. So this, I think, brings me to the next point here, which you make really well in the study, again, is really this key metric of load factor. And look, I think we're at a moment right now, right? Everybody's talking about abundance. Ezra Klein book's out. I'm going to be at an event this evening of the Abundance Institute, which is like a right of center think tank. Everybody's talking about abundance. And there's kind of this, I think, question out there of like, how do you do abundance if you have scarcity at some times on your grid? But I think the fundamental point here is we actually right now have an abundance of energy the vast majority of hours out of the year. It really does come down to managing that peak. So you put some really interesting numbers. You have some interesting graphics on this, and you show load factor, basically how much energy is used compared to the overall capacity, not nameplate capacity, but like functional capacity. And you've got a load factor for ERCOT at 53%, which turns out is like right at, I can't remember if it was median or mean, but it's like right in the middle. So our grid is vastly underutilized. And you said in the report I'm reading from it, a system's potential to serve new electricity demand without capacity expansion is determined primarily by the system's load factor, a measure of the level of use of system capacity, and grows in proportion to the flexibility of such load, i.e. what percentage of its maximal potential annual consumption can be curtailed. So basically, we are in a situation right now where we could, in ERCOT, take a whole lot more data centers using that slack that is there, so long as they have some amount of flexibility worked in. How does ERCOT compare? I think I said it was like right at the mean, but you had ERCOT, I think, is the third highest of all the balancing authorities in terms of its potential. Can you talk a little bit about ERCOT's potential vis-a-vis this key metric of load factor?
Yeah, sure. And appreciate you kind of running through that, because I think we all know at an intuitive level, right, that we kind of build the whole system around peak. But when you really sit with the numbers, it is kind of extraordinary. And so just to like put it in another term, so like more than 10% of the system is built to serve approximately 35 hours a year of extreme peak load. What that means is that, like, we all say there's no headroom on the system, right? Like, we have to build out the system, and we should build out the system for a bunch of reasons. But the bottom line is, like, there is headroom. It just exists outside of these sort of occasional extreme swings in weather, right? From the heat waves to the cold snaps. And so in terms of ERCOT, you're right, they landed right at that 53% load factor. And what that means specifically, right, it's the average demand over the maximum peak demand. And in this case, it's based on 9 years of hourly load data. So looking at whatever the maximum realized peak load was in ERCOT over those 9 years, and then taking the average over those 9 years. And that actually was the average and the median. So, and obviously, the load factor we would expect to be higher in the winter and summer generally. And so it is meaningfully higher in ERCOT. I think it gets up to like 65% load factor in the summertime on average in ERCOT.
Right.
But there are systems that actually are meaningfully higher in the summer. And what's actually interesting about ERCOT, it is one of the minority number of systems where the winter load factor is actually, in this, it's like just below its average load factor. So that means there's a lot more headroom available in the wintertime. And that's partly because, right, you do have these like occasional, obviously, like polar vortex style cold snaps, and obviously Winter Storm Uri is part of that. But outside of those very extreme systems, there's a lot of headroom generally. So we could probably peel back a little bit more, some of the metrics there for ERCOT, but what it all end up aggregating to is that if a new load was able to be flexible for a relatively small amount of time, you could add meaningful. And I do want to say one thing, which, I sort of said a little bit at the beginning, which is, those numbers you quoted for the headroom and ERCOT, that, that we should view that as sort of a technical potential assessment, a first order assessment. We want to go a lot deeper to more precisely characterize it. So when you layer in the transmission constraints and then the intertemporal constraints on the generation, the load, that will eat away at some of it. But by the way, even if it's half of those numbers, it's still quite substantial. But a key thing to just note here is that the headroom estimates that we put forward, they discount all of the reserve margin that's available on top of the existing realized peaks. So actually, if you counted for the reserve margin, it could go higher. And actually, we don't know. The final headroom number for some of the systems could be less or could be even more once you account for the reserve.
The load duration curve you had in there is really amazing. I remember looking at some of these back when I was director of the SPEAR, the South Central Partnership for Energy Efficiency as a Resource, and we did some reports about demand response and its potential. And I remember at the time being really struck by those load duration curves. They really, obviously it's a podcast, so you could go to the website. I'll put a little image from the paper and of course a link to your paper there so folks can go look at themselves. But it sort of looks like a skateboard ramp, right? It's like, you could call it a hockey stick, but hockey stick you usually think of as going like from left to right and up. It really like starts on the left side as like there are very few % of hours out of the year when you get these really high peaks. And then you kind of come down this curve. And for the vast majority of hours, there's just this massive headroom. And ERCOT, you plotted all of the systems compared to each other. And ERCOT actually has more room than most of those systems. And like you said, the utilization is less in the wintertime, which suggests you didn't do this in the paper, but it might be something for a future paper, Tyler, if I can make the suggestion. It would be to like break out summer versus winter, because I think that you would see even that skateboard ramp would look even steeper in the wintertime because you get these really high peaks. But for the vast majority of the winter, you have so much headroom, which keeps us coming back to like, what do you do about those peak hours? And so if you want to say anything more about winter versus summer, I'm always wanting to talk about that because I think that discussion is not front and center enough, especially in a place like Texas with the inefficient heating loads, the resistance heating loads we have. Summer and winter just need to be treated very differently. So you can answer that question if you want. I'm going to layer another one on that I want you to take, though. Go ahead. You want to do that first?
We're just really quick on the comparison of winter to summer. So we didn't actually put it in the report, but when you look at like the average durations of these extreme peaks and then the average duration of the curtailment events that would be required for flexible loads, the average is substantially lower in the winter generally than the summer. And so what this tells us is that the nature of the peaks in the winter, they're much like spikier, right? So you'll get these like polar vortex events that might come in for a handful of days. And then especially in the morning period from like 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. when everyone sort of wakes up and, turns on their electric heating system and their other loads, it spikes for that, like 3-hour period, but then it dissipates quite quickly. Whereas in the summer, you have a little bit more of a constant and higher sort of load factor because it extends from like, the middle of the afternoon into the middle of the evening. So it's these very occasional extreme cold snaps, especially from polar vortexes, that's driving this shift of loss of load expectation to those winter mornings. But the good news is that like a little bit of flexibility in the wintertime gets you a long way.
Yeah. What I'm wondering, Tyler, and I don't know if you guys I don't think you didn't look at it for the report. Obviously, I read through it, but I wonder if this is, again, like some future opportunity for research, if this just come up in discussions. I mean, obviously, there's load flexibility at the data center, right? But then, there's also like load flexibility throughout the system. Is there some role for the data centers themselves as they come onto the system? Perhaps some kind of fund could be created to reduce the peak on the residential side, which would free up even more headroom for them. Of course, there's also this whole question of like what AI itself could do to optimize load and actually like move loads around in a way that doesn't impact comfort at all. In fact, could actually increase comfort by doing things like pre-cooling. I mean, you could also get into some like really interesting areas of like AI effectively being sort of like self-aware, like energy aware of what it's using and moving its own air conditioning load around. I mean, the potential for all this stuff is really massive. I guess the main question I want to ask out of that, Tyler, though, is like, isn't there some potential to have load flexibility on the residential side that would then help states and regions free up headroom to bring these data centers onto their grid?
Yeah, I love this question because you can start to think about flexibility in a variety of ways. So why are we so interested in the large loads? Part of it is that so much of the near-term load growth and medium-term appears to be driven by these large commercial customers. And some of the numbers are eye-popping, like, right? It's like up to 50% of U.S. electricity load growth could come from AI-specialized data centers over the next 5 to 7 years, according to some forecasts. And obviously uncertainty post-DeepSeek, all that. But nevertheless, there's going to be a lot. And so this is coming out as fast, and we need to plan for it better. And the opportunity it presents, though, is that, right, these are such large-scale single-point loads that are under the control and operation of quite sophisticated operators, right, with also very high willingness to pay and the ability to sort of incorporate new technologies and systems. And so just for like a bang for the buck standpoint, right, if we can get one load, right, at multi-hundred megawatt scale to implement a flexibility measure compared to the challenge of going out and signing up, hundreds or thousands, right, of residential scale and small commercial scale, there's just an economy of scale there. That said, there are a variety of reasons we could talk about why, there may be hesitancy for some of the data centers to implement some of these flexibility measures. So if they're unwilling or unable to offer any flexibility to the system, another arrangement is that they could go out and procure that flexibility from other customers. And so you might think about that as what we might call a virtual power plant or a distributed capacity procurement. And so they could actually be, for example, like paying customers to install smart, thermostats and smart hot water heater appliances, right? So that they heat up the water in the home 2 hours before that, extreme winter morning event rather than, right when they wake up when everyone else is just running. So that's one way. I mean, by the way, like just any measure to put downward pressure on those peaks, including weatherizing homes so that on those winter mornings, they just draw less power. Like it's the same concept. You are creating system headroom by putting downward pressure on those peak draws. And so I think you could imagine a variety of different arrangements here that could create the same kind of headroom for any given system. You had mentioned this, but we didn't mention earlier, so I just want to make sure it's clear. One of the reasons there's kind of this thesis that the AI specialized data centers can be more flexible is because the training workloads are substantially more batchable and deferrable than the real-time, cloud computing and inference-based loads. And so this is proven, right? There's like a fascinating literature on this, but it's absolutely possible that in a lot of cases you could defer or front load a computational training load by a handful of hours such that you could put some downward pressure on during that winter morning peak.
Yeah. No, that's exactly the point I was getting at with the sort of inference versus training versus cooling. I do just want to, before we move on from this, I do want to come back to that point. Tyler, like you were talking about earlier just a minute ago about winterization and what that might mean for creating more headroom. Loved this study. It answered a whole lot of questions I had. It also raised like 50 more questions I have. So any researchers out there listening, and Tyler, maybe you guys could take this one up in a future iteration. I'm specifically interested on ERCOT when you look at how much solar and storage we have, right? You just said a minute ago that you see more hours in the summertime where there's sort of scarcity, and that's kind of the way it used to work. But then you see these peakier times in the winter. They may be shorter periods, but they're kind of these, peakier sort of spikes or spiky kind of demands. I think where we're headed in ERCOT with all of the solar and storage coming online, over 30 gigawatts right now, on our way to 40 to 45 in the next kind of 18 months or so, that we are going to see more of the problem. I think it's already there, but I think this shift is going to be more pronounced in future years, where the winter is really the problem and where you're looking for the headroom is during those cold winter nights and mornings. And there's some demand flexibility, of course, on the residential side, but it really kind of comes down to the heating elements. And can you replace that really inefficient resistance heat? And if you can do that, you're creating more headroom. So I've started to talk to some of the data center folks about this, of like, look, if you guys really want to get onto the ERCOT grid, this is something we've got to talk about, is the winter nights and mornings. That's where we really have the problem. So I don't know if that came into the analysis, if the analysis just showed something different than what I'm saying, but I wonder if like the rapid, increase in solar and storage has maybe changing that a little bit on the winter versus summer analysis.
Yeah, absolutely. This is such a critical aspect of all this in terms of the shift of loss of load expectation in a growing number of jurisdictions from the summer afternoon and evenings into the winter mornings. And this has occurred in the U.S. Southeast as well. And part of that, right, it's just like solar and battery storage is like a victim of its own success, right? Like it is reducing loss of load expectation in the summer afternoon and evenings. And that's terrific. But then, what loss of load you have left is now being driven by these cold snap, occasional polar vortexes. And especially as more people have, as you said, these inefficient sort of strip heaters, right? There's a big opportunity there, but it is creating challenges. So, of course, we all know, we don't need to restate it, but yeah, the solar profile is not that strong from 6 to 9 a.m. Maybe if we changed our time zones, we could shift that. But I don't think there's going to be a lot of uptake there. So, you're not going to get a ton of solar production in the more. But the good news is these are relatively short durations. So, I mean, honestly, I think in some systems, even like 2-hour lithium-ion battery storage can make a really meaningful contribution to the winter morning peaks. But certainly 4-hour can. And then, this is kind of boring, not sexy stuff, but literally just getting people off of these super inefficient space heaters and upgrading those. I think people will be very surprised like how much progress we could make on creating more headroom just by implementing those measures. So there's a lot of other fascinating dynamics around these winter morning. So we had this system here in the Southeast, Winter Storm Elliott, a couple years ago, which was the largest rolling blackout event, at least on Duke's system here, I think ever. And actually, the primary cause was that thermal units, primarily gas and coal, failed, somewhat similar to what happened during Winter Storm Uri. But nevertheless, there was a real spike on this winter morning because the same thing, polar vortex style. And you can get into all sorts of, even the point I made about like, okay, solar doesn't contribute on winter mornings. Well, it's true that it doesn't produce, but if it helps charge the storage in the day leading up to, right, that winter morning peak, it actually could make a contribution. But also, if it helps save fuel, even in like the 24 hours leading up to that spike, like that can make a contribution. So there's actually like what we need to do is get a lot better at looking at the synergistic capacity value between different resources. And there's been some great research on this, and E3 and others have sort of quantified it, but we need to think more about like the interaction of different resources and what that means for effective load carrying capability during these winter morning systems.
Yeah, completely. All right. So yeah, and I just think all of this is like what I want people to kind of take away from this, right, is even incremental, what seemingly like marginal changes, 0.5% here, 1% here, that frees up a significant amount of headroom as long as it is timed, as long as the measure, the program, the offering, whatever it is, syncs up with the time of the highest system need. And so it could be energy efficiency, it could be demand response, like, all of the above on the demand side, so long as that measure links, batteries are a great example, as long as it sort of links up with that period. You wrote in the paper, Tyler, that demand response program participation stalled in the mid-2010s. Can you talk a little bit about that and why that happened?
From like an academic standpoint, to sort of isolate all the variables, you'd want to do like a formal analysis. But I think there's some clear like overarching trends that occurred. Like one is just that we became long on capacity in a lot of markets. And so that depressed capacity prices on average. And at the same time, like we weren't in a load growth environment. So when capacity market prices decline, you're just less likely to see an incentive for existing loads to participate. And so I think that's the main factor. There were other measures, some of the capacity markets put more restrictions on the participation of aggregated, distributed energy resources. So there were some sort of pullbacks there that I think also mitigated some degree of participation. But I think the biggest macro factor was just like we were long on capacity and we weren't in load growth environment. All that is changing, right? So like just look at PJM, right? Order of magnitude increase in capacity market prices, right, over the past couple of years. So I think generally, like even setting aside all these other like supply chain constraints and whatnot, we would expect to see more participation in demand response, right, in the coming years. But I think even more significantly, we might see more load flexibility because of this speed to power incentive, right? The ability to interconnect to the grid more quickly to the extent that you can offer flexibility to the system.
So let's talk about that. Is that sort of a core policy solution? If you're talking to a policymaker that's trying to figure this out, hey, we kind of want these data centers. We know there's national security implications to having AI here versus abroad. We know that there's investment associated with this and tax base. But, if you're a policymaker, you're probably also really freaked out about a Winter Storm Uri or Winter Storm Elliott repeat. You just can't have that. So like, what are the policy mechanisms that you look at? Is that one of them, some kind of a speed to interconnect if you agree on the front end to some number of hours of flexibility?
I think so. And those are some of the conversation we're hearing. And, ERCOT, as is often the case, is sort of out on the leading edge here, just in terms of creating like service constructs. So the controllable load resource, the CLR, service there, they made some improvements to it even a couple of years ago, right? That like more explicitly sort of quantify and characterize this trade-off of load flexibility in exchange for faster interconnection. And I think in that case, right, they were trying to design a product that could allow a new large load to get online within 2 years. So that, I think that's a meaningful contribution. I'm sure there are a variety of different ways that could be further improved and optimized. And it is tricky, right? If you're talking a real-time control, so maybe there are other sort of variations you could do on that would still kind of have this basic trade-off of faster interconnect. Because I'll just say one other thing, and actually it relates back to the winter discussion we have. It's just like, when we're talking about the polar vortexes and these particular kinds of systems, we can forecast them. I mean, in some cases, you can see it coming like 2 weeks out, right? But certainly within a week, or multiple days. And of course, the weather forecasting is getting much better. That's a great contribution that AI is making too. So we can plan more in advance. And so, we might not even, at least for the winter events, like we might not need the loads to be on a fully like real-time controllable load resource program to be able to, get them to offer a lot of headroom to the system.
Totally. And look, this is where I think, we talk a lot about like all the above on the supply side. There's sort of an all of the above on the demand side we need to talk about as well. There are the controllable loads, and those are really attractive. You actually, in your paper, quoted ERCOT, and I believe it was a NERC presentation they were making where ERCOT stated that, and I'm reading from the paper, and you put quotes around this, that ERCOT said that the optimal solution for grid reliability is more loads to participate in economic dispatch of CLRs. Optimal solution for grid reliability, right? If you actually have these loads participating in the market. So that's one thing. There is a bill in Texas right now, Tyler, Senate Bill 6. We're recording on April 3rd. By the time this comes out, I might already have these articles out, but at some point I'm going to have some articles out on Senate Bill 6, I think it's really a bill that is designed to deal with large loads and their integration. I don't think it does a lot of what it needs to do, but there is one particular part of the bill that I do like, and that is basically setting up sort of a new emergency response service. Texas has like about a gigawatt, 1,000 megawatts, of course, of emergency response. About half of that is demand. There's a provision in that bill that's a 24-hour notice. So like ERS right now is no more than 30 minutes. There's a 10-minute and a 30-minute. And to your point, when these winter storms are coming, we know they're coming. You can see them a mile away. Like, 1 week out, it may be a little uncertain. By 3 or 4 days, you're about to experience a major event. So you have this sort of 24-hour product. So there could be loads that can't participate in economic dispatch as a controllable load resource on a day-by-day or hour-by-hour basis. But in an extreme circumstance with 24 hours notice, they could reduce their usage. So I think the main point of that is there's all different kinds of demand flexibility, and they have different values, and they should be valued accordingly. But, we need all of that, or we're going to be very limited in the amount of load we can add.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And the other important point related to this emergency response service is that we probably shouldn't expect that AI specialized data centers are going to participate in demand response because of the economic incentive. I mean, unless prices go so high, which maybe in some markets you could imagine that happening, or if you sort of redesign some of the price signals, which is another fascinating research topic, which I'll just plug for people, is if the addition of a bunch of new load increases loss of load risk or expectation for the existing load, then you might think about setting that as a price signal to the new load to the extent that it's putting more burden on those periods of loss of load expectation. So there actually could be something there. It would be kind of a redesign, I think, of the way demand response currently works. But, in general, we probably shouldn't expect this to be a price incentive. It's going to be to the extent that it helps them get online more quickly. And then when we're really talking about, emergency situations where we're just trying to, mitigate rolling blackouts. And I think that can still make a really meaningful contribution.
So related to all this and talking about different kinds of demand flexibility and requirements for coming on a grid, whether just normally or in an expedited way, I'm also wondering if you started to think about a need to distinguish in policymaking, rate setting, even demand response program design between different kinds of large loads. So just like with data centers, it's going to be different if a data center's sort of more of a traditional data center like you described earlier that's doing, cloud versus inference versus large language models. There's differences there, but also with other large loads that are coming onto the system. So in Texas, we have all sorts of load that increase from industrial electrification, oil and gas wanting to electrify fracking operations, steel mills, chip manufacturers. I'm wondering if you've thought about, do we need to be really distinguishing between the different types of large load, particularly if you're talking about some kind of expedited, interconnection? Because if the only thing is sort of flexibility, crypto miners are very, very flexible, but then you have to ask yourself, would I rather have a crypto miner than a, Samsung chip plant? Probably not. So I don't know if that came into this at all, or maybe, again, some kind of a future direction for research is to kind of look at the different kinds of large load and how policymaking might be different for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, we were oriented here towards kind of the AI specialized data centers because this is kind of the big trend that's emerged so fast that we're all trying to get our arms around and better understand and just because of the scale. But to our earlier point, we were saying, smaller commercial loads and residential loads could also offer flexibility. I mean, this could be true I don't think we oftentimes like to talk about, factories as being flexible because we don't like the idea of ever interfering, in a manufacturing line, which also gets really expensive. But look, if these large factories have their own on-site power options or on-site batteries, I mean, it's the exact same principle. So let's not discount that some of them might have an interest in doing that. They may not. I think the other thing is, yes, of course, they also want to interconnect quickly, but it's just not the same breakneck speed to market and also this global, competition that has major national security implications in terms of the AI race. So that's a little different, I suppose. But ideally, we should for any large load or small load for that matter that could offer flexibility that creates value for the broader grid, we should be making sure that there are service contracts that, acknowledge and enable that. So let's not discount it. There is something about, just the scale of the data. So actually, this is a good question. So how many of the non-data center loads are like over 100 megawatts? And I don't have a good data sheet in front of me. My sense is that even some of the largest factories we're talking about, like not a lot of them go beyond, the 100 to 200 megawatt range. So like in Duke Energy's case, they've rolled out all these new sort of guardrails to require like more upfront security and guarantees from new large loads. But the threshold they established, right, was over 100 megawatts. And, there's probably always going to be like some degree of an arbitrary threshold there. But you could also think about in terms of like the number of upgrades to the system that are being triggered by it. So maybe you do it and, there's like a dollar threshold cutoff. But I think it is probably useful to think about this when we are talking about truly like quote unquote hyperscale facilities that you're talking about, billions of dollars potentially of, system upgrades and new generation resources that may be required.
Yeah, you write in the paper about the potential for lower ratepayer costs from this kind of a load flexibility. I wonder about this, something I think about a lot. Affordability is really important to me, and I think it needs to be a central goal and really kept, right in the center of policymaking, at least right there, riding sidecar with reliability. I think they're 1A and 1B, and depending on context and what's going on, they may switch places, but they're right there, just sort of like joined at the hip. I guess I'm worried, Tyler. I'm worried that these big sophisticated customers are going to work the system effectively to get themselves the lowest cost. I know that there's a lot of willingness to pay, but there's also a lot of motivation to control those costs. It's part of the competition. And as time goes on, those pressures are going to get higher. Is it really feasible that residential and small commercial customers could do better with these big loads coming on? I want to believe the answer is yes. Tell me the answer is yes.
I think so. I mean, you look at just the change in the past 6 months, 6 to 12 months, and we've seen multiple jurisdictions, at least in the Eastern Interconnect, start to put meaningful additional guardrails in place. So that sort of starts with like this push towards more upfront security, right? Like more security posting so that, if they were to back out or if they were to shut down, within a certain period of time, that if upgrades are made to the system, that the rest of the ratepayers aren't left, completely on the hook for that.
That's also in the Senate Bill 6 I referenced earlier. That's a part of it as well. Yeah.
So I think that's kind of like the basic step. I imagine we'll see a lot of jurisdictions going that direction. But then there are other, more substantial proposals. So like in Indiana, where it's a similar thing, they just had vast new forecasts for new data center loads. There have been proposals to just like completely firewall any upgrades that are triggered to the system, whether for new generation or for network upgrades, to completely insulate, the existing ratepayers from that and assign 100% of it to the new loads. And, I mean, we used to have the whole paradigm was we meet any new load at any cost. And that's just, I don't know that paradigm really holds up when we have this much coming this fast and when their willingness to pay is this high. So, when you start to send that full price signal, look, right now in this current environment where the willingness to pay is just off the charts, it seems like they'll sign, almost any amount. Obviously they're always going to be incentivized to reduce costs, but, presumably like there's going to be some rationalization to the willingness to pay at some point as things sort of settle out and the breakneck push sort of settles. Although who knows? Who knows what the future holds?
Yeah.
But
I really do think though what you put your finger on at this paper, like the load flexibility is the key to that, because if you can actually like control those peaks, that matters for reliability. It also matters for affordability, right? Because that's when prices are highest. So I think there is the potential, if the policymaking construct is right and the pricing construct is right, that if is doing a lot of work in that sense. But if it's right, there's the potential that these large loads bring new resources in, have flexibility and able to turn down, and maybe even dare to dream, pay into some kind of fund to get some savings on the residential side to create more headroom. I can see a scenario there where residential customers win on this, but I don't know that that's the most likely scenario to play out, be the way I'd put it.
Yeah, we need our regulators to, take this moment really seriously and get as smart on this as possible. That was, one of our goals with the paper, but we all need to pitch in, right, and help to educate, because we're all learning, we're all catching up at the same time, right? So we need to spend more time, spreading that and educating all the stakeholders and the regulators as quickly as possible.
The learning curve is almost as steep as your load duration curve. So before we end, Tyler, this has been great. I do just want to ask you, because you've done a lot of work, you've written and spoken a lot about interconnection processes. I'm just going to read a quote from some testimony you gave to Congress very recently here, earlier this year in 2025. You said, while load flexibility can help, interconnection delays remain a major obstacle to deploying new generation, and the volume of projects stuck in interconnection queues has quadrupled. However, there's one market, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, that has taken a different approach and is achieving significantly greater interconnection performance than other U.S. markets. Between 21 and 23, you said to the Congressional Committee, ERCOT interconnected at least 70% more generation capacity than any other organized market, despite serving a load that is half the size of PJM. I'll let you tell us more about this, but what I am often critical of ERCOT, but I also try to give credit where credit is due. And this is a major success story for Texas. Can you talk a little bit about what Texas does differently, why it's working so well, and maybe what the rest of the country could take away from ERCOT on that?
Yeah, I mean, I really don't think you can overstate the significance of what ERCOT has accomplished over the past 5 years. And look, like, it didn't become clear as to just how much greater its interconnection performance was going to be until you were in an environment where there was just such a massive backlog in the other jurisdictions. And that has only occurred right in the past 3 to 4 years. And I have to say, like, it's not that often when you have one market that has performance that is so fundamentally different than any other market, and where you can attribute that so clearly to a different set of rules. But that's what we have here, and it is truly extraordinary. And so, look, like, ERCOT is energy only, and so they don't study and assign costs to generators based on what we call, deliverability studies, which are basically, trying to assign them as designated capacity resources. And so it is
having
hard.
Sort of an administrative process where somebody decides this is the value of it. That step is not necessary here.
Yeah, and all the other markets do, right, is they create this linkage between interconnection service and capacity eligibility. And so what they're doing in all the other markets is, generally, most of the generators come in and they say, we want to be a capacity resource. And so they're studying them as capacity, which we call network resource interconnection service. And that involves this much, much more rigorous set of study criterion. And then it's 100% cost allocation. So all the upgrades that get triggered under this very extreme set of contingencies and local stress cases, 100% of those upgrades then get allocated to the contributing generator. And I think, look, there are various factors that have contributed to the meltdown and the queues elsewhere. But the most fundamental of all is this linkage that they have made between interconnection service and capacity eligibility. And it's binary, right? So it's either you're 100% capacity or you're 100% energy only. And we should just be clear, like, this is a policy decision that the rest of the country has made. And what it really is, it's an extremely high barrier to entry for new generation. And so when you set up barriers, well, what happens? When you're in a capacity-constrained environment, you get 10x in capacity market prices, which is what's happened at PJM. So, obviously you can't copy-paste or cut energy only into the rest of the country, but we're trying to figure out what can you do to adapt those efficiencies. And we could probably do a whole segment just on that, but it's an important sort of task to figure out.
Yeah, look, there is no like pure platonic form of an energy-only market or capacity market. Capacity markets, of course, have energy markets, and energy-only markets have some amount of capacity procurement. We do have some in ERCOT, and it's all about sort of like, where are you turning the dial? Are you really like yanking it all the way to the other side, or are you adjusting it? And there's probably some adjustments can be made. But I appreciate you saying that. I think the same. I probably don't say it enough. Again, it's just a negativity bias humans have. We'll talk more about the negative and the positive, but ERCOT really does deserve credit for this connect and manage and for putting that much more generation onto the grid in the other places. I appreciate you highlighting that in your congressional testimony. All right, I got one more question, and then I'm just going to ask you the open-ended question of what didn't I ask you? But I forgot to ask this earlier, and I need to ask before we end. You mentioned it very briefly, DeepSeek. How does DeepSeek change your ideas about load growth, or does it at all? So DeepSeek, maybe just give listeners, I think most people will know what we're talking about, but give just a quick little background. And I guess, the fundamental question here is, are GPUs, are these chips going to get so much more efficient in future years that maybe we won't see as much load growth? DeepSeek seemed to be more efficient. So has that changed any of your priors or not so much?
Yeah. So I guess the background on it is everyone thought that the U.S., actually the numbers leading right before DeepSeek was that we were, somewhere in the range of 3 to 5 years ahead of China, right, on developing foundational models and neural nets. So it was a shock when they came out with this app that seemed to have comparable capabilities to, our most advanced, at least public large language models. And, there were various metrics that it was scored on. And by the way, right, there were all sorts of efforts to sort of keep China from getting the GPUs to develop these foundational models. So this was very shocking. And, look, I think the jury is still a little bit out on it. I think one of the key realizations was that this was not actually an original foundational model that they developed. Like, they basically built upon all the existing work that the foundational models did in the US. And then they sort of jury-rigged it with these, very clever like engineering techniques to develop a comparable system that was more energy efficient. By the way, we have no idea what they actually spent on it at the end of the day. Like, that data, we can't rely on it. So it's hard to know what, but I think the basic takeaway, and like, there's a ton of fascinating engineering detail we probably can't go into, and it's not also my area of like deep expertise, but I think the basic takeaway is they were able to leverage all the gains of the existing foundational model. So my general sense is there was this lull for, a few weeks and about a month, and then everything has come like roaring back, and there's still these massive forecasts for data center load growth. There's still, major capital expenditure plans from all the hyperscalers. OpenAI is, full steam ahead on Stargate. So, who knows? Like, things could always shift, and maybe something else will come out from China, right, in the next year that could change things again. But it appears that we're full bore ahead for now. But the last thing I'll just say on is that it does introduce like meaningful additional uncertainty, not just into like whether there's going to be all this investment in data centers, but what are the inference loads going to look like? Because one of the key innovations, right, is that you can do a lot of this locally, and that's what Apple does too, by the way. So it's just very unclear, like, how much of these inference loads are going to go to the data centers versus what can be done locally.
So interesting. So much there. Tyler, this has been great. Your report is a huge contribution to all these discussions, Rethinking Load Growth. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. Tell listeners where they can find you on the web, on social media. We'll put those links in as well. And then I always like to ask at the end, was there anything I didn't ask that you wish I would have asked? Anything else you want to add in closing?
Yeah, great to be here, Doug. There are a couple other Tyler Norrises out there, I guess, including a guy who was on, The Bachelorette or whatever. So I'm Tyler H. Norris.
There's also a lobbyist actually at Austin.
I've heard about that too.
Nice guy. Yeah.
There are a few out there.
Studying load flexibility. Yeah.
Tyler H. Norris, Duke, and I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn are my primary venues, along with Blue Sky. But although trying to extricate from Twitter, but it's difficult. And Doug, you maintain just a good presence there that you keep drawing us back. But no, this has been a terrific conversation, and I'll just say that, like I said at the beginning, this was a first order analysis. We're really excited to go to the second and third order. So we're working right now to get the model up and running. We have this very sophisticated model developed with ARPA funds. It's sort of an advanced unit commitment economic dispatch model. And we have some really neat new techniques for sort of representation of transmission networks based on publicly available data. So if researchers out there, or if you're a hyperscaler, you want to collaborate on research, we would love to talk, and much more to come on this front.
Awesome. Tyler, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Great to be here. Thanks, Doug.
Thank you for listening to the Energy Capital Podcast. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, please like, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Until next time, have a great day.